we're going on the side.
This next one is called Stinky Feet. It's about stinky feet. When I say stinky, you say feet. Stinky, stinky. When I say stinky, you say feet. Stinky.
Check.
goes wrong. It's just any of those roads goes bad, all the other ones get backed up.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Sure.
But it said staying out of Dixie Highway. We did it. Broke news.
You're here early too. I don't know if they start right here.
Oh, is that
Yeah, there's all three of us halfway.
seats. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. I'm Jen. I'm the organizer for Science on Tap. Welcome. This is where we bring community and curiosity together to learn about science, so thank you for joining us. We have an event the first Wednesday of the month right here at Radio Artifact, our amazing partners, and as well as Urban Artifact. Appreciate y'all coming out. Super excited about this collaboration with the EPA. Was so excited when I messaged them and they'd heard about our program, so awesome. It's always good to be known and to find more science advocates. So thank you all for being here. I don't believe in big intros, so I'm just going to hand it right over to the experts. Really excited about the topic. We only have one planet and it's constantly changing, so effective and safe water reuse is kind of an important topic, unless y'all found another planet for us.
So welcome. Thanks for coming tonight. I feel like I'm doing stand-up a little bit. That's good. So I'll introduce myself and the other speakers, and then we'll kind of go through in order, transition from slides. Hopefully, we won't go too deep into the details, but we want to give you a flavor of the research that we do, as well as kind of frame the issue. So hopefully you'll get some of the broad picture as well as some of the details. So I'm Jay Garland. We all work up the hill at the US EPA lab it's at the end of Jefferson and MLK. It's a big, ugly building, kind of a brutalist architecture building up there. But it's the Office of Research and Development within EPA. So we do research to inform regulatory policy. We are not the enforcers, we're not the regulators, but we're the scientists who kind of provide information for that work. So I'm Jay. My background real quickly is I'm old, so I've been working for a long time. And I've been with EPA for about 13 years, and oddly enough, Jen made that comment. What I did before here is I worked for NASA working on life support missions or systems for extended space missions like lunar base or Mars base. So really, how do people go live on a different planet? But I kind of, I tell people I had a midlife crisis when I turned 50, and I came back to Earth because I wanted to do something real. And I think what we're doing with the EPA is far more important than what I was doing with NASA. So I'm Jay, and next is Sissy.
Hi everyone, Sissy Ma, also from ORD, and I'm part of the water reuse team. Glad to meet everyone here. Thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Michael Jane. I am an environmental engineer by training, and I work with these guys on water reuse, and I specialize in microbial risk assessment. And so you hear today about how we try to determine fit-for-purpose water quality requirements for different types of water reuse.
All right, so I guess I'll start, and then we'll rotate. You guys don't have to stand up here, probably, right? Or just two over there, and then we'll kind of rotate. So the research, the title here first. Again, I said we're with ORD. We do research to inform policy decisions. Now, in this case, normally a lot of what ORD does is we inform what the program offices do in EPA, like the Office of Water, the Office of Air, the Office of Land Management. We work with them. For this particular effort, our main stakeholder is not the program offices, but it's more states, localities, and utilities that are moving forward with water reuse. This is happening across the country. The reason why we're working with them is that EPA doesn't regulate water reuse. It's not part of our regulatory framework because it's not part of the legislation now. Reuse has happened over the last 2 decades, and really it's a new field, but it is occurring. So we're trying to help people who are trying to implement this. So, and we're trying to implement them to do safe water reuse, and that means, is it going to be safe to drink, right? That's what your first concern is. But also the effective part of it is we're talking about changing our water systems from the current state into a new state, and we want to understand whether that does it make sense to do that? How much energy does it cost? Is there a bigger footprint and issues with moving and changing? So both safe and effective. Mike's going to talk about the safe part. Sissy's going to talk about the effective part. And I'm going to provide a little bit of an intro. Just general outline first I'm going to give you a background, kind of try to help you think about why do we need to think about changing our water systems, number one. And then two, we'll take what we would consider a shallow dive into these two different topics, the safe part and the effective part. You may not think it's that shallow, but trust me, we're scientists. It was really hard for us not to show a lot of data. We tried to pare it down. We are going to show you a couple graphs, but hopefully not too scary graphs. And then the final thing we want to do is a little bit of direct engagement with you on this the idea of, you know, how do you communicate about the safety of water? Well, we can tell you the science behind it, but sometimes it's just best to drink the water that you produce to kind of verify it. In this case, we're not going to ask you to drink recycled water. We're going to ask you if you're interested, you can drink beer that was brewed from recycled water. We have that from one of the companies that's doing this. They're based in San Francisco. So we'll have a little beer tasting at the end. So I'm going to start off by justifying why do we need to think about changing our water systems. One of the big drivers on that is our climate is changing dramatically. And the data here is from the fourth National Climate Assessment. It's a little bit dated, 2017. But, you know, even back then, 6-7 years ago, the projections were that we're going to have chronic, long-duration droughts. And that's already occurring, particularly out west. We know that's a problem. And that puts a stress on our water systems because there's less clean water available to supply the system. The second thing is that not only are we having less water, we're also having more water in these heavy rainfall events, including back east and really throughout. And that also puts a stress on our water systems because part of our water systems includes the wastewater collection, includes stormwater collection. And when we have those big events, we have combined sewer overflows. We have here in Cincinnati and other places. That stormwater that flows in overwhelms the collection system, and it's actually raw sewage that's discharged to the environment. That's the combined sewer overflow. So that's another stress on our water systems. And finally, if you live near the coast, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, from this perspective, we don't live near the coast, but that is a significant issue. The data from 2017, they were talking about chance of inches rise over the next couple decades. I read a report last night that verified that I used to live in Cape Canaveral, Florida, when I worked with NASA. There's a 9-inch sea level rise there in the last 10 years. And that is also seen on other parts of the southeast coast. So that puts a stress on our water systems as well, right? Because you're talking about all these distribution systems, both the wastewater for collection of wastewater and the drinking water distribution lines, they are subject to infiltration of water from rising sea level. And that is a really big concern, especially for coastal communities moving forward. And so that same climate report, it talked about water, and I know this is kind of wordy, but, the problem with water is that, I bring my wife so she can heckle me. Bring it on.
She's not wrong.
The challenges with the changing frequency of a drought and heavy rainfall, sea level rise, it's compounded by the fact that our current infrastructure is, typically gets about a D-, D plus maybe in terms of the score from the civil engineers. Our infrastructure was put in place a long time ago, especially the distribution lines, and that is a problem. Maintaining those is a challenge, and so you have this kind of confluence of changing climate and deteriorating water infrastructure. And I like this quote in the bottom here. It says, because water management strategies designed in view of this evolving future can only partially predict, right? Playing the game of predicting the future is very difficult, all right? So we need to realize that we can only partially predict what this future is going to be. What that means is that we really need to look at novel opportunities and alternative approaches in anticipation for what may be more or worse change than we see in the future. And, I just leave you with this last slide on climate change, if climate change bothers some people. But this is from the 2022 report. And basically, if you read that report, the tone of it is like, listen, we've been talking about this for about a decade now, and we've been telling you that this is an issue, it's growing, and all the data suggests that the warming is faster than we thought, the sea level rise is faster than the original models projected. This is an issue, and what this says is that we're already kind of getting past the point of of just living with it. We're going to have to adapt and try to mitigate this. And it's really going to be a challenging next few decades simply because of that. All right, so for those of you, I don't mean to be doom and gloom. When I talk to my kids, I try not to be doom and gloom. And some people, don't like climate change. Okay, but let's put this all aside. Assume that the future climate was going to be the same. There'd still be a strong argument that we need to change our water systems. And that kind of gets into this question of why do we have the systems that we have now? Why do we have this, we have these large linear networks where we collect water from some source, bring it to a city, have you, drink it, and then you flush your toilet, and then the waste goes somewhere, hopefully downstream of the drinking water plant, and that's our system. That was a great solution for the 19th century, 20th century. It's not so good anymore, and the reason for that is that there's too many of us. There is no downstream. Everybody is downstream at this point, right? And we see that with some of the growing accumulation of some of these common contaminants like PFAS, perfluorinated compounds, and microplastics. So this linear perception that we have a resource, we can extract it, we can use it, and we can dispose of it, and the environment will clean it up, really doesn't work because there's too many of us. There's too much stress on the water systems. So we know that doesn't work. But why do we have that system? Well, because first, we felt like there was we had enough. There was plenty of water, there was plenty of resources, and that worked. And it did. What it solved was public health issues with contamination from fecal sources and disease spread, right? So that was good, but it was a great solution for that, but not in the world that we live in now. The good side of this, though, is that the other reason we have those systems that we do is that we really couldn't do much more than that. We didn't understand the fundamentals of the biology that's going on. We have so much more advanced technology of engineering and biological engineering right now, designing and monitoring systems, microelectronics, and other kinds of capabilities that we can do so much more. So the motto, the take-home message from this slide is that we need to do something different, and thank goodness we have the capability to do that. So we can move forward into a new future. And people talk about this transformation into a new system where you're not just talking about historically where you've got a water system that all I'm doing is I'm producing water, I'm making sure I'm meeting my regulatory standards, I'm really just kind of plumbing up the already existing city, and it's all very centralized. And I'm going to charge people based on the volume of water that they use. That's historical, but moving forward in the future, we're really starting to think about water as part of the circular economy, where we're using the water, we're using the other resources in wastewater. We're not going to talk a lot about this, but there are nutrients that we can use in the wastewater. There is energy in that wastewater. There's all kinds of things, and this kind of gets back to the roots. When you're in space, there is no waste, right? And all the compounds you produce are no longer waste, they are resources. And that's true for life on Earth too, and that's really the direction that our water systems are moving. So let's talk about reuse. Some people would argue this diagram is from a book from Gilbert Trejo, talked about the water recycling revolution, and it really is rapidly advancing. And the idea here is that, kind of from using the evolutionary ideas that first we just disposed, but we knew that wasn't that intelligent, but we moved forward into this high level kind of modern man where we moved first to just reclaiming water and maybe using it on agricultural fields. We moved to actually what they call indirect potable reuse, where you treat the wastewater to a certain standard, then you put it into some environmental buffer for a little bit. Usually it's injected in the groundwater, let it be there for a certain amount of time, and then pull it out for drinking water. And now there's talk about direct potable reuse, where you're taking the wastewater, treating it to a high standard, and then you actually plumbing that directly into the drinking water system. And that is occurring, particularly out west. In California, most of the major cities are moving in that direction. And this is good, but I don't actually like this kind of linear monolithic path, right? Where this is the only way. We're kind of replacing one form of centralized water system with another. We are reusing the water, but it's really still thinking this linear approach. Plus, it's very, very kind of monolithic and like this is the only way to do it from a centralized perspective. And if you want to use the evolutionary kind of paradigm to compare, this is the way evolution really works. I mean, this is the evolutionary tree based on the molecular identity of organisms. And what we know is that there's multiple paths. There's to solving life on Earth, multiple paths, and there's kind of connection. There's shared genetic information across what are very disparate kinds of organisms. So the point is, when we move into this new future, we need to think about this as the end state, not one single monolithic centralized approach involving kind of toilet to tap, but really multiple approaches. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight, some of these alternative approaches. And one point I just want to get across too is you think about water reuse. This is all planned reuse. You need to think about it in comparison to what we're doing now. What's the base case right now? The base case is we do a lot of reuse, right? All water, first of all, is reused. You all had your 8th grade science class where, it was the water cycle, right? And all water is recycled. But in this case, we know that a lot of wastewater is ending up in drinking water. We just put it in an environmental buffer for a while, like the Ohio River, and it flows down, and then someone brings and takes out the Ohio River, but that still contains lots of wastewater. So what this map shows is those dots show the percentage of the fraction of the drinking water intake that's composed of wastewater discharges. And the numbers range from anywhere from 0 up to 15 or more than 15% of the total volume of the drinking water that you pull up is treated wastewater, but it's still wastewater. So it's kind of like de facto or unplanned reuse. And that is occurring. You can't see that map pretty clearly. In Cincinnati, we're at about somewhere around 5 to 10% of our drinking water is wastewater discharge, right? So keep that in mind. We already are doing water reuse. Why don't we do it smartly? Why don't we do it in a planned way now that we have these additional tools? So, one of these twisted paths in the evolutionary tree, one solution to water reuse is thinking about it on a more decentralized way. If you look at a building, there's two ways to look at a building from a water perspective. This gets back to the idea that there aren't waste, there's resources. You can think about all the water that's generated in a building as wastewater that you have to deal with, a problem. But you can flip it and call the problem your solution. Those are all locally available water sources that you could treat and reuse and not have as much reliance on transporting water to the site, drinking water to the site, particularly transporting drinking water to the site to flush your toilets, for example. Why do we use potable water to flush your toilet? I was struck. Mike and I were at a meeting a couple weeks ago where the Gates Foundation person who's in charge of the Gates Foundation has an effort to reinvent the toilet, to really think about these same kind of concepts. And he was an African individual who never used a flush toilet till he was, I think, 15 or 16. And he said when he walked up to it, he was scared first, but he also was, when he realized what it was, he said, why am I going to use that drinking water to flush the toilet with, because it's a valuable resource. So thinking about it that way, that the problem is the solution and things are not a waste but a resource, you can think about a building as a source of all these different kinds of waters. What you normally think of wastewater, what goes down the toilet, but you could also think about the source separated hygiene water that you use, the shower water, not the fecal contaminated or toilet contaminated. It still has some feces in it. Mike will tell you all about that. That's his... But also rainfall that falls on the roof of the building that you can collect. Also rainfall that may fall on grade around the building. And the reason why we separate that is that when it falls on grade, storm water that hits the surface of the city environment, it's much more contaminated than what hits the roof of the building. But there's also things like AC condensate in the building. All the water that's condensed off the coils of the AC units, that's another source of water that can be used. So that's really what we're going to talk a lot about today. Is we've really worked with communities around the country that are interested in producing, really pushing this decentralized concept. And really getting back as how well do you have to treat that water, various sources, for non-potable uses, and does it make sense? What's the energy kind of trades on locally trying to treat water versus just relying on the centralized supply? And just just so you know that we're not talking about, this is real. I mean, I used to talk about made up stuff because I used to always talk about what was going on Mars or the moon that hadn't happened yet, right? But this is really going on. These are examples of buildings on I guess that's your left-hand side is the Solaire building in New York City. They've been doing this where they've been collecting all the wastewater in the building, treating it in the basement with what's called membrane bioreactors and advanced disinfection, and recycling that water in the building, like I said, for over 2 decades now. They use that water for cooling purposes and for toilet flushing. It's not for potable use. But they do it mainly to avoid sewer tax because, again, New York City has big problems with CSOs, combined sewer overflows. So that's their driver. The building in the middle is from Portland, Oregon, not as water constrained as, say, California, but they introduced this recycling system so they could get LEED certification for the building. And they actually designed a system that is part of the landscape so that you really and increase the property values to have that kind of setting. And you could, the one picture is those little purple, pots or whatever. Those are part of the bioreactors that they put spotlights on them to look purple. So I guess, if you're really bougie, you can sit around and drink your cocktails and, in front of your purple bioreactor. And the one on the right is from San Francisco, where they have actually mandated that any new building over 25,000 square feet needs to incorporate dual plumbing to have this kind of on-site reuse. And again, these are high-end buildings that are charged extra premium, and they've been recycling, in this case, gray water, as opposed to some are recycling the combined wastewater. So it is occurring, and that's who the group are working with. And this is kind of the research plan that we developed, that we've been working, Mike and Sissy and others have been working on over the last, really like 8 years or so in our EPA labs, to look at a few questions, right? We're talking about taking these various sources, treating it for non-potable uses at different scales, ranging from maybe a single home to buildings or districts of buildings. And the 3 questions that we wanted to look at is, 1, how do you define acceptable treatment? That's what Mike's going to talk about. That's the safe part. The second question is, once you define safe, how do you know that the systems are continue operating safely? We're not going to talk about that too much tonight, but that gets into how do you monitor it? How do you ensure that you have continued operation that as you designed it for? And then the third question is this broader context of, does it make sense? Are you having impacts like increased CO2 production, increased cumulative energy use because of what you're doing locally? And so one way to rephrase that, we often talk about that first box. What Mike's going to talk about is proximal risk. What's the near field risk of actually consuming that water, whereas the broader questions of really looking at what does this make sense is kind of a distal risk. What problems am I causing away from the people drinking the water, but are having an impact more either locally, regionally, because I'm using more energy and it's really just not trading well. So that's what Sis is going to talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike now.
All right, thanks, Jay. All right, so hopefully everyone's feeling good about water reuse. And now we can jump into some of the more technical stuff. And so I'll try to make this, understandable, but there are going to be some dense slides coming up here, so just give everybody fair warning. Make sure you have a drink. So the central question here is, how do we define acceptable treatment for these systems? And so by definition, we're talking about alternative water sources. And so how do we understand what the water quality is of those sources? And how do we characterize these different types of water? And so we mentioned how we talk about rainwater versus gray water versus wastewater. And how do we first characterize the quality of these alternative water sources? Does the scaling effect matter? And so when we talk about building scale systems, obviously we know a lot about municipal wastewater from doing this linear approach for hundreds of years, but when we start going down to a building scale, does that change the water quality? And so you're going to hear a lot about pathogens from me, and so these infections, they are sporadic, and so not everyone is always sick, but if you go to a citywide population, then there's probably somebody who's sick at any given time, and those rates tend to stabilize as you get to bigger populations. But then when you're in a small building, that's no longer the case. And so maybe no one is sick and there's never any pathogen in the building until someone comes in, and now you have maybe 1 of 5 people who's sick and they're shedding pathogens, and so there's not a lot of dilution that occurs there. And so you get this variability in concentrations where it's often very low, but then you see these high peaks. And so how do we account for that in our risk assessment models? And then finally, this question of fit for purpose water. And so Jay mentioned that, it doesn't really make sense to use potable water to flush toilets. And so if that's true, which I think, we'd agree at face value, that makes sense. How do you actually characterize that, when you're trying to set science-based treatment targets? And so our approach here is to use risk assessment to really look at, what is the actual risks that are associated with these systems. And so these attempt to specify a set target level of risk, and then we basically back the level of treatment out from what our de facto condition is to what treatment will get us down to the level that we need. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to pick a risk target. And there's a couple different targets you can choose, and there's different endpoints that you can choose to base those on. And so sort of our default is based on infections. And so there's this number on the slide here, 1 in 10,000 infections per person per year. And so 1 out of 10,000 people who use the system will get a pathogen infection from using it. And that's typically what we've accepted for drinking water in this country. And so that's certainly a valid metric, but this isn't drinking water. And so, it's not like something that you have to turn on the tap and it has to be that quality, because people are choosing to install these systems. They know that maybe it's lower quality, and they're going to use it in different ways. And so, that maybe isn't the right metric for these types of applications. Another one you might choose is based on illnesses. And so not only do you have to get an infection, but it can't be asymptomatic. It actually cause you to be ill. And so in this case, we're talking about gastrointestinal illnesses, so diseases that cause diarrhea. And so, we say, 1 in 100 people might get diarrhea from using the water. And the reason that I bring that benchmark up is because that's what we've accepted for recreational water. And so you may not realize this, but when you go and you swim in a natural body of water, this is what the regulations are based on. And so you're basically accepting that risk by getting the benefits of recreation. You're accepting a higher risk level. And then this last metric is this 1 in a million disability adjusted life years, or DALYs. And this is kind of a more technical one, but I really like it because it takes it all the way to the impact of the illness. And so not only do you get affected, not only do you get ill, but then you miss work, or you end up, being sick. You maybe non-gastrointestinal outcome, maybe you lose a limb or you die, and how do you account for those effects? And it's not, thank you. Yeah. No, but seriously though, so this metric really does mean, this metric means like a disability adjusted life year is a year of life lost. And so if, really, this is saying that, 1 out of a million people who use this would lose a year of their life, either from death or disability. And so, and I have another slide on that coming up here too. So, and then, how do we actually do this? And so, what we do is we develop these pathogen log reduction targets, or LRTs. And so, this basically says, what is the 10-fold reduction from your source water concentration that gets you down to these acceptable levels of risk, depending on what you choose. And along the bottom of the slide here, if you can see it, there's some of the pathogens that we look at here. And you'll notice I'm only focusing on the microbial targets here. Because this is non-potable use, chemicals, the exposure volume is so low that the dose makes the poison, right? And so the exposure can be so low that you really don't have to worry about chronic exposure to chemicals, things like PFAS. That isn't a big concern when it's just flushing your toilet. However, if you do get exposed to a small amount of one of these pathogens, that can be sufficient to make you sick. And so that's why we're focused on these. And so these different types of pathogens we have viruses, things like norovirus. These are very common foodborne illnesses. If you ever get food poisoning, it's probably norovirus. There's also protozoan targets. And so these are things like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. If you heard of beaver fever, that's like things that we get from animals. And then there's also bacteria, which are things like Salmonella, E. coli, and things like that. And so just a little bit more about what this looks like. And so, on your left, you see basically the infection-based framework. And this is kind of, again, the default framework that we apply. And so you have some source water, you have some risk-based treatment, and it gets you to a certain level of infection. And then moving to the right, this is where it gets to that DALY benchmark. And you'll see why I like it here, because not only do you have to have an infection, but that infection has to make you ill, and that illness has to lead to an impact. And this is really consistent, I think, with our modern reasoning with respect to COVID, where, when COVID first started, we're kind of controlled for infections, and as everybody cared about infections, make sure is asymptomatic infections were still concerning. But then as we've kind of progressed, now we no longer, care about infections, and we really care about managing for illnesses and impact. And so, we try to say, get vaccinated, so if and when you do get infected, you don't end up having severe outcomes. And that really, I think, aligns with this DALI-based framework that we're talking about. And so the way that you actually calculate these targets is with this process called quantitative microbial risk assessment, or QMRA. And the panel there on the left shows kind of the process for how we calculate these numbers. And so at the top there, you calculate the exposure volume. And so these are different end uses. If you flush a toilet, how much water do people ingest when they flush a toilet or when they irrigate their lawn? And so these are not very easy numbers to come up with because it's a combination of exposures, whether you're touching the water and then touch your mouth, or whether it's aerosols that are generated, droplets when you flush your toilet. So you have to estimate that volume. Then you have to figure out the density of pathogens. What is the actual load of these contaminants in those water sources? And that gets back to this source characterization question, and trying to model the concentrations of all these different pathogens in all these different source waters, and a lot of work goes into that. Then once you're actually exposed to the pathogens, what happens? Particularly as you move to these illness and DALI-based frameworks, what is the likelihood of getting infected, then becoming ill, and then having a missing work or having some more severe outcome? All those have probabilities. They all have models that are used to show how an exposure gets to an effect. And so we use that to get from the pathogens you have to actually the outcome that you experience. And so we can run that model, and that gives you, by putting those three pieces together, you can predict what your risk would be from using untreated water, and then you take that, compare that to your risk benchmark, and then you figure out how much reduction on that source water concentration do you have to apply to get to that risk benchmark. And so it's an iterative process to try to figure out, what is the number that gets you down from your source water concentration to something that meets your selected benchmark. And on the right panel here, this is kind of this laying out this fit for purpose mentality that we apply, where we have different sources of water, ranging from high quality waters like roof runoff down to black water, which is toilet water. And then on end uses, from non-potable end uses, some like flushing toilets, all the way down to potable uses. And so we can use that to compute a matrix where we have unique treatment targets for different combinations of source waters and end uses. And so what makes this really work is that it's a structured and transparent framework. And so anybody can take this and they can look and see exactly how you got from A to B. They can debate the input parameters. You can update them as new information comes out. And so this is evolving science. And so we can go back and we can reevaluate our assumptions and say, is there new evidence that would have made a different decision? And we can use that to update our LRTs accordingly. And so it's really flexible and adaptable, which kind of cuts both ways, because when you're changing treatment targets, that does create uncertainty, but also we're talking about public health here, and so it's really important that we're using the latest science and making sure that our assumptions are in line with that. All right, and Jay mentioned too that this wasn't a hypothetical system, that people are actually doing this. And so this cover report you see on the left side there, this is a report that we put together with some external stakeholders to really lay out this whole approach. And what does this look like? How do you do it? How do you develop regulations based on this? And then, really the key table of this report is what's shown on the right, and that is this matrix that I talked about, where we have these different source waters, different end uses. I'm not sure how much you guys could read there, but we have reading down the table, there's different end uses of wastewater, black water, stormwater, roof runoff, and then within each of those, we have different end uses, irrigation and indoor use, which includes toilet flushing. And so, any of those combinations, you basically look at the table and say, here's my source water, here's my end use, find the number that matches for you. And reading across, there's three different columns. Those are the numbers for viruses, protozoa, and bacteria, respectively. And then finally, one additional thing on this table I'll point out is that there are, in each one of those cells, there's two numbers, and one is based on a 1 in 10,000 infections benchmark, and one's based on the 1 in 100 illnesses. And so we provided two different numbers for people to choose from. We weren't using DALIs at the time, but now in our recent work, this table has been expanded to also include DALI-based numbers, which I think is a major advancement. And so this is, this approach and this guidance document have already been adopted into a number of state and local regulations. And so California, Colorado are really leaders in this. Washington State has forthcoming regulations based on this approach. They're considering other places as well. And then importantly, we've also been working with the plumbing code groups. And so if you're going to build these systems, someone actually has to install them. And they actually have to have a plumber who can actually hook up this system in your bathroom. And there's a lot of subtlety there in terms of what they can do and can't do based on the code. And so, we've been working with these organizations, which as you can maybe imagine are quite rigid, to try to adapt these new approaches into their existing plumbing codes. And so finally, this is my last slide. This is just, how do you actually do this? And so, what you have to do is you have to pick your treatment train, you take those LRTs from that table, the total log reduction target, and then you have to stitch together different treatment processes that together can achieve that log reduction target. And so every treatment process has a log reduction value associated with it, and those numbers have to add up. And so here, the treatment train we're showing is a membrane bioreactor, which is a compact biological treatment, works really well for these systems that are in basements, combined with UV disinfection and chlorination. And for each one of those, there's credits that are received for the viruses, the protozoa, and the bacteria, and you have to make sure that the total sum of those numbers meets or exceeds your log reduction target. In this case, you'll see that it does, and so this is a valid treatment train for achieving your risk target. And so that's really how you get to these risk-based treatment systems that will be that they're going to be safe because they're designed that way. And so with that, I will transition over to Sissy to talk about whether or not this makes sense.
So I'm a system scientist, so I'm interested in the issues from a system perspective. So in the water reuse, on-site water reuse work, so there's a lot of things to thinking about, like Mike and Jay mentioned. It's not just water, there's also energy used to get the water to the target. So what's the impact? What's the broader impact, say, greenhouse gas emission? So what's the potential burden shift? We have some hidden trade-off, so we need to look into that. So we use some of the system tools, assessment tool, to do that. Before we do that, I just want to mention to compare the on-site decentralized system. The reason we do that is because the centralized system, the larger system, use a lot of energy. We're taking water from groundwater, from surface water, that takes energy. Acquisition, you're moving the water to your treatment plant or treating that water takes a lot of energy. And then after you treat the water, you distribute the water, it takes a lot of energy to move water. So for example, here is the work we did with this region, Greater Cincinnati here, and DWTP is a drinking water treatment plant, and then drinking water distribution, and then wastewater collection, and then wastewater treatment plant. So you can see, like Jay say, our water source is Ohio River, and the Ohio River is not that clean. And our system here have the largest UV and also the granulated active carbon. It's a treatment process, largest one in the country, because try to remove a lot of contaminants in the water. And you can see that the first bar is pretty high. That's why we invest a lot of energy to get the water clean. And then moving the water, the treatment plant is at the bottom of the valley, and then the massive network system move the water all the way to Lebanon. So you can see there's a lot of energy. A lot of time people don't think the water that you open your tap is actually very expensive to get that quality. That's why we want to see, does that centralized system treating the water, moving the water to you, making sense, or decentralized and making sense? So this is the system diagram that we are doing, using an approach called life cycle approach to evaluate, say, this decentralized system making sense. So on the top here on the left is centralized system. You got the drinking water to the user, and the user use it, and then the toilet water, the black water we call it, still go into the wastewater treatment plant. But the gray water is going into the system, like Mike mentioned. For example, the treatment train using the membrane system, advanced disinfection system and then reuse the water. So we evaluate this process. Not only that, the life cycle approach is taking into account the indirect input to the system. For example, the chemical they use, the energy you use, what's the resource they put in to produce the energy or produce the chemical. All this impact get captured. Or in the end, say you need to dispose your system, that disposal cost also take into account. So, for example, we study this on-site water reuse and then develop a tool, understand, from the front to end, what's the impact. And then we use that tool to evaluate the whole country, the nationwide, and say, different water, source water, alternative source water, for example, rainwater, AC condensate, gray water, or black water, which one is a better alternative one? And for example, on the left one is the rainwater. Yeah, so the rainwater, not everywhere have rains. See, the country on the northwest side and then Florida on the southeast has more rain, more humidity. Same with the AC condensate, on the Florida has more humidity, generate the AC condensate. But all of this water doesn't 100% satisfy the demand. Mostly it's about 20%, 15%, but you still need that additional water to meet that. But at the same time, gray water and wastewater, you always generate that waste stream. So that's your source water, alternative source water. So thinking of, say, if you capture the rainwater, right now there's a lot of people want to say stormwater. There's a lot of tons of the storm coming down. You want to capture the water, stormwater capture potential. Yes, you can, especially with the climate change, your precipitation sometimes is very intense. You can have, a couple hours have tons of rain. You can't capture them all unless you have, huge cisterns to capture that. So there's rainwater. So the blue water, the blue dots here is the rainwater. The green one is the AC condensate. You can see on the y-axis is the volume of the system. So in this case, when the system is very small and you still need to build that retaining, like a cistern to capture the rainwater or AC condensate, and there's a lot of material and the infrastructure invested in to build that. But the amount of rain may not happen every month or every week. So you still have the infrastructure built it in, but when the system become larger and larger, you can see that's where the excess gets on the right side. The rainwater and AC condensate could be below that line. The y-axis is the greenhouse gas emission, which means a lot of the energy or material built, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emission along its supply chain. For example, you use your electricity from the power plant, and then there's a lot of greenhouse gas emission along the way. So these are capture those total cumulative impact. But the system, there's an economy of scale. When the system become larger, you can see the rainwater and AC condensate could be negative greenhouse. That means could be offset a lot of the greenhouse gas emission, use it in the drinking water otherwise that you avoided. With the yellow one and the brown one, the yellow one is the wastewater, and the brown one is the gray water. And you can see these are usually the largest system. And when economy of scale shows, and when it gets larger, the greenhouse gas offset could also be reduced. And also these two with the gray water and wastewater, these two systems are the wastewater in the building without recovering the thermal energy in the wastewater. So we don't think actually there's thermal energy embedded in wastewater that we usually just get lost because that gets into the collection system, going to the treatment plant. But in the building, you have opportunity to collect that wastewater, to collect the thermal energy, and which is huge. We didn't show it here, but you can see the arrow. When we take into account the thermal energy, the whole impact is going to be much more negative, which means you can offset a lot of the energy that you might have to use your furnace or heater to do that. So this is the cost picture. So people interested in, does this make sense and is it cost effective? And you can see that the red line, the 1-to-1, means the system present net value is equivalent to the potable water, the water price that you get from the central system. And also you can see the curve is when it's getting larger, the price getting closer or maybe even less than the centralized system. Especially when you take into account, the energy recovery, that whole system can be much better showing than your water price than the centralized system. Especially now with the water price gets more and more expensive across the country, and that red line is going to move up. So those decentralized water reuse systems become more and more appealing. So that's why a lot of the communities are investing in those pictures. So Jay, want to have the closing thoughts?
Thanks, Sissy. So we didn't show too much data, but just a little bit, right? Thanks to Sissy and Mike, you guys did both a great job of trying to describe that data simply. So the take-home message is, this treatment guidance that Mike talked about, it's been established. So we now have these standards. The states, localities that are doing this, they have the information. And Mike was being very modest. I mean, the work that Mike did, it's really now, we were at a meeting 2 weeks ago of the community of people that are doing this work. And what they talk about right now is that we are at an inflection point. So we're kind of really at this point of massive rise in utilization of these kind of reuse systems because the regulatory uncertainty has been cleared because really of the work that Mike did. So thank you, Mike. And at the same time, there are people that want to do this for all those reasons I mentioned, that because there's water stress in San Francisco, they're going to require people to do this. They want to avoid CSO and sewer tax, they're going to do it in New York City. They may want to develop green buildings, in these LEED certified buildings, they're going to do it for that purpose. So there are lots of drivers, but the work that Sissy talked about is that it does make sense at some fundamental level. These are efficient and effective ways to reuse water. Now moving forward, it gets back to that graph I showed about the evolutionary trees. There are multiple paths going on. We're looking at alternative systems and multiple solutions to our current state and into a future state. And it's likely that there's going to be different solutions that are optimal for different places. Sissy mentioned, right? If you're in the southeast, it makes a lot of sense to really focus on rainwater, AC condensate as alternative sources of water. In a lot of the country, not so much. You really want to focus on these dirtier water streams, but now we have the technology to treat it. So decentralized makes sense, but it really matters where you're at. And overall, we're at an inflection point, right, of generally adopting water reuse, whether it's centralized, decentralized, or a mixture of those in different applications. And so we're going to move to, we want you to share our, the recycled beer from, first off, we thank you. I mean, we all work in the lab all day and we want to have meaning in life, right? We do this for you. I always tell people, I work for the federal government, I'm here to help. Some people think that's a bad term. It's the proudest thing that I can say about what I do every day, right? And I really mean that. You pay my salary, and I'm here to do good things for you, and I really do feel like we're trying to help out, but it's so nice to kind of reach out and talk to you all. But now onto the beer. This company, it's called... and
you get no money for this?
No, I don't. I don't work for this company. This is a company called Epic Clean Tech. They are in San Francisco. They're one of many developers of these kind of on-site systems that we described. This is their motto is that they don't want to put it in the basement. They want to produce this very pretty machine. So that's an actual picture of one of their units. Something they want to put in the lobby of the building, right? Something that's very visually appealing. So that is a gray water treatment system for treatment of gray water, the hygiene, shower water, other sources of non-toilet waste, for treatment and reuse on site. And so that's their business model. They also brew beer on the water they produce, mainly as a kind of a marketing kind of approach. And they've been on TV, and they've got Time's Best, one of best inventions of whatever year that is there. So we want to end with that, but I guess we want to open it up for questions too. And I think Mike's back there with the beer. We don't have a lot. I had to bring this back in my backpack from the meeting that we were in DC, so I apologize. It's only like 4 beers with little cups. Thanks to my wife for getting the cups today, and thanks for not razzing me anymore too, Victoria. Appreciate that. So as we kind of distribute that around, just open it up for any questions you guys might have for any of us.
Is, by any chance, reverse osmosis involved in treating that?
Yeah, the treatment trains that we mentioned are there. It isn't for the non-potable use. We don't require the RO, but the RO treatment is part of, mentioned the DPR, the direct potable reuse. That is part of the overall treatment train.
I was asking about the beer.
Oh no! In this case, it is not. It's pretty much an MBR kind of advanced disinfection system.
What is the
UV
MBR?
is
Membrane bioreactor, so that the
well, I thought the MBR, then UV is the next step, right?
yeah, but in a direct potable reuse, they would treat this. If you're going to drink the water directly without using it as for beer, you're going to undergo some form of biological treatment like membrane bioreactor, then some kind of advanced membrane ultrafiltration, and then moving on to reverse osmosis treatment, and then disinfection. In this case, it doesn't go through the RO, so you can choose to drink it or not. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you heard anything about the infrastructure bill contributing to our improvements to our water systems?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, that when I talked initially about our infrastructure getting a D rating, one of the reasons for that is we haven't invested in it over the years, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill or law, the bill funding is a massive investment. Now, people argue that it's only a drop in the bucket for what we need to do, but it is the biggest investment that we've made in infrastructure in decades. So it is going into both improving the system that we have. I mean, so Regan is here from our lab. She's heavily involved in one of those areas is funding replacement, an elimination of the lead service lines in localities, really. That's an important thing to improve our current drinking water infrastructure. The other big thing is trying to remove some of these emerging contaminants like PFAS. So there's a big effort within ORD as well as EPA to really look at improving that, and that some of that's funded through the bill, and also the localities and states that are eligible for getting the funding for that are trying to put in these more advanced treatment systems. And you also, for the reuse, is an option that the way the bipartisan infrastructure law, most of the money is going to funding from localities, states that want to invest in new systems. And water reuse infrastructure is one of the things that they can get money for. So it is a big help. Probably, and there's even more needed in the future, unfortunately. Yep.
And so I'm sorry if this was already answered, but so the water that I drink, like when I turn on my sink and I drink the tap water, did that water also go through the same type of, like when you say MBR, UV, radiation, stuff like that?
No, well, Sissy mentioned that it goes typically with drinking water, and there's bigger experts in the room on drinking water than me. I'm looking at Regan, but typically there's some form of flocculation and sedimentation to get rid of the particulate matter. Then there can be UV disinfection to help disinfect what pathogens might be there. And then there's also this granulated activated carbon treatment where you kind of adsorb some of the other chemical contaminants that are in the water. So that's done. It's not as much treatment as is done on these planned reuse, because the starting point, however dirty the Ohio River is, it's not as dirty as your toilet water, right? So you need more more treatment to kind of process that to a drinking water quality standard. But we are, yeah. That was the hardest thing about moving to Cincinnati. I'm from Cleveland, and being downstream from Pittsburgh is a very bad thing.
Yeah, every time they have a major event in Pittsburgh, don't they like time it down at the Miller treatment plant to not pull in the overflow that's happening? And the other thing is the Miller treatment plant is huge UV. I mean, they have great big UV beds, and most of the water goes right over these UV beds. But they need that chlorine, of course, for the residual disinfection.
Right. You got it, man. That's it. Yeah. Then the other issue, after you do,
PDHs, that's all. I'm just here for the PDHs.
I mean, after you do the treatment, and this is with any water distribution system, whether it's recycled or just the normal drinking water. Once you do the treatment, we add disinfection, residual, like chlorine, to maintain that quality as it's distributed through the system. Because as the water ages and that disinfection residual decays, then you can start to get growth of organisms within the distribution system, and that's a real problem. In that case, it's things like Legionella that can be a problem within the distribution system biofilms that kind of grow on the pipes. Other questions? Are you guys ready for the beer?
Yeah. You're lining up. Yeah.
I have a silly question.
Sure.
All of this bottled water, pH, high pH water, what source do they start with something like the Ohio River?
No.
And then continue to treat it, or how did they get their high quality?
Typically, a lot of those are from springs, so it starts with a good quality water, groundwater source that's uncontaminated. So that's usually it's not the Ohio River. It's not a surface water source. It's usually a groundwater source that's thought to be, or that is, relatively clean. I know there's the one. What was the one water bottle that's from someplace in Fiji? I mean, it's actually from Fiji, right? And they ship that here. So that always, you think about the work that Sissy is talking about, doing life cycle analysis of all the costs of collecting that water and distributing it. Boy, that's pretty expensive water. Yeah. Other questions?
Well,
yeah.
Speaking of beer, you've heard the old seagoing stories of sailors and everything not wanting to drink the water, but they'll drink the beer because the beer has been boiled or something.
Well, it's been fermented, and alcohol itself is a disinfectant, right? So yeah, it's certainly.
So beer is better for you than water.
That's what Ben Franklin would tell you. But and the same thing with cider too, right? Like the whole thing about Johnny Appleseed, right? His myth was generated by the fact that he was a real guy and planting apple trees as the colonization advanced across the country, right? And because that's what people wanted to drink, because it was, in that case, safer than some of the sources of water.
Isn't that how we survived the Black Plague?
Well, that's a deep question. But yeah, I think, obviously clean water source is a clean source. The problem with alcoholic beverages as your sole water source is not, it's somewhat of it's a dehydrating, kind of compound. So drink water. Enjoy beer, but drink some water, right? Yeah, drink tap water. Don't drink Fiji water. Anything else?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yep.
These package units, these package plants that they might install in a building, what about the odors that they from during that process, and how do they vent it, and is there any migration problems if I'm in a building that, this device, is it worse than just say my sanitary sewer gas
Yeah.
coming up in the building? What are you hearing?
Well, we heard from, like I mentioned, this meeting we were just at, which was with a number of people who operate these systems. They do indicate that's the number one thing. If there's odors, that really turns everybody off, right? But it's not a real big issue. It just needs to be properly. The examples where the odors were an issue was really just poor design and not because they're often in these tight spaces in basements and they're really not thinking about proper ventilation. but it is easily addressed. So I don't think it's not limiting their implementation. Just you do need to factor it in. But as I don't know. I was in OTR the other day, and there's a lot of smells there, right? I'm talking about from the sewers, right? So again, based relative to base case, right? What's coming off sewers as they exist, I think it's readily manageable at a package plant building scale. Regan, oh, she's going to ask an expert question. Yeah, so that's a really good question. We didn't mention that, but Mike and I are involved. Yeah, sorry, and I was supposed to do that across the board. I apologize. So the question was, what about? We were talking about building scales, and the advantage of doing this at a building scale is that you tend to have an operator that's responsible for the unit, and like I mentioned, those examples. There are companies that do this, and the business model is sound, and the one in New York City has been doing it for 2 decades. They have systems across the country. And there's advantage to that, right? Because somebody's monitoring it, somebody's maintaining it, and they're professionals. But there is this large movement to household-based systems too, where people want to think about doing it themselves. Now, it could be relevant for if you're, depending on where the house is, you want to be kind of off the grid and you don't have a source of drinking water or wastewater lines. But it's even beyond that, just from the point of view of San Francisco is really looking at this. How do you expand it at the household level? And there are companies, we talked to 3 of them last week that are developing what they're called recirculating showers, where you start to take a shower and the unit is designed where it actually is recycling the water that you produce in the shower as you shower. And the really big water savings there and really huge energy savings there too, right? Because you're not the water that's being recycled is warm water, so your hot water heating bill is dramatically impacted. So there's some advantage to that, but we're trying to understand how well do they actually treat that water to safe levels. That's something that we're looking at. But that generally that is one big push in this sector. People are talking about appliance-based reuse systems, where whether it's your they're talking about showers, but also not dishwashers as much, but it's washing machines and showers at present, where there are companies that are actively trying to market these type of systems. Where you can plug them in. The idea is you plug them in and they just work, right? They're somewhat autonomous, which I think is, it's interesting. It's really different than the way we're thinking about water, right? Because normally we think water is there's a utility, there's some public agency that's providing clean water to us. And how do you ensure that this system is operating well over time? But it really is where a lot of the sector is moving at this point. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Yes?
That was actually almost my question, but doesn't the cruise lines already have been using that type of system where they separate the gray water and use it for flushing versus coming out of your tap?
I'm not too familiar with what they do on cruise lines. I know the Navy was interested in that. They were looking at source-separated gray water for treatment and reuse on the ship. So I'm not surprised that they can do that, because it would be the same kind of treatment systems we talked about today, right? So that's definitely a possibility. Although I do know that they still discharge wastewater into the ocean, right? But that would be the black water, right? Considered, not the gray water. But just back to your question, Regan, and even there, I mean, I think there's just this idea of the multiple paths, right? There's a lot of solutions right now that people are exploring. Maybe it's different scales at a household versus building versus district, and we're trying to produce these various types of fit-for-purpose water. But there are actually buildings that are producing drinking quality water too. I mean, that's a whole nother, direct potable reuse at an individual building scale. So there's a lot of different paths, and as we, when there's any kind of advancement like this, we're going to probably end up with different solutions simultaneously, and they probably will sort themselves out. I still think there needs to be different solutions for different places, but there's likely to be maybe multiple solutions experimented with, and then kind of winnowed down to different approaches. The example sometimes people use that is that, we had horses and cars on the same roads for a while, right? As your experiences change, you have alternative approaches that are existing simultaneously. One is likely to eclipse the other at some point, but they simultaneously exist for a while. Yes.
I'm curious to know what the buildings or areas that have adopted this, what was their primary motivator? Are they environmental folks, or, I mean, to them, all of the costs that we looked at, they wouldn't see. They just see the end cost. They don't understand the thermal energy and all that other stuff.
And I'd say it varies. I'd say there's three main bins. One, it's water stress. So there is regulatory drivers at the local level to say you must do this. San Francisco is a really good example of that. They're saying that any new development you have to put in this on-site reuse. San Francisco is a really unique case, right? Because they get their water from the Hetch Hetchy Dam up in the national park, right? That is, I don't know how, it's a day's drive away basically. But they have pipes that go all the way to San Francisco, supply water only to San Francisco, cross all the agricultural lands, and they don't tap into that. But they have this very pristine source of water. But it's still, they're looking at reuse as a way to maintain the viability of that clean water source. So that's one, just like water conservation. And we've conserved all the water we can, we've reduced low flow fixtures, et cetera, but now we're going to recycle this to improve the overall efficiency. The second is this driver to produce, you can get points for LEED certification and just general value of the property because you've got this green technology in place. The other driver is, like I mentioned, in New York City. It's actually not on the drinking water side. New York City has plenty of water, relatively speaking. Their bigger problem is the sewer, the combined sewer overflow. So they make their money at the Solaire building. They're a profitable operation, and one of the parts of the profitability is that they avoid the sewer tax, the money on how much sewage they produce, because they're basically producing half that they normally would because they're recycling it back to flushing toilets, and that's 50% of the overall flow. So I'd say those three, but hopefully that in terms of overall planning, you really would be making decisions at a regional level or a local level that may be based on what makes sense long term for this community and this area. And just to know, I mean, Ohio, the state of Ohio is part of that consortium that I mentioned. They recently joined because there are parts of Ohio that have the same kind of concerns about water availability. This is mainly in central Ohio, where they're using groundwater sources for drinking water, and the aquifer is being depleted. And then there's these large developments that are going in place, business developments related to solar cars and battery. Very large companies opening up that require a lot of water. So they're actually looking at reuse options here in Ohio, even what we think is a water-rich kind of area. Question? Yeah.
The package plants again for, say,
I'm going to step down out of the light, and that way I can hand the microphone to Sissy or Mike to answer a question too.
These package plants that you'd use maybe for flushing your toilets, is it truly like a closed loop system? And if it is, if you're really using the same water over and over, could that be a problem? Is there ever a need to introduce some fresh water to that?
Yeah, you definitely would. If you can have a completely closed system, the buildup, one of the incompatibilities with humans is we just produce these salts and we need to remove them at some point, right? Because they will build up. That's where the RO might come in, where you have to actually introduce that kind of treatment, the reverse osmosis, to remove those kind of dissolved salts.
What do they do on the space station or in space? They're water, I mean, obviously.
We'll get there in a second. But let me answer this gentleman's questions first. But the systems that we're talking about, they're not closed. like in San Francisco, where a lot of this has happened, and any of the ones, all the buildings I showed you, they're still hooked up to the centralized drinking water. So they're getting fresh water into the system, and they also are hooked up to the wastewater. So the solids that are produced in these reactors, they're discharged into the sewer. So they're not closed. But if you move to that completely closed concept, you do have to really look at much more advanced treatment and think about these imbalances. And in space, right now, first off, like lunar base or Mars base, the really long-term operation of these kind of closed systems, we don't know how to do it. Nobody's done it yet, and there's still a lot to be. That's one of the, I think, limitations for long-term space travel. But on the space station, one of the things they do is they take all the water that's collected, like urine and the condensate from the atmosphere. They actually use a physical chemical process. It's a vapor pressure distillation. So they take advantage of the vacuum of space, and that's to make it relatively efficient. And they do recycle the water that way. And in essence, they distill the water. So that's a pretty good way to produce purified water. But it's still very limited, right? They still, they don't take showers, and there's not a lot of flush. It's very limited water use.
Question?
So please, I think Mike's got beer poured back there. Please taste the beer, even if it's not RO'd. It's safe, trust me.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. Again, thank you all for coming. If this is your first Science on Tap, you can find us on Facebook, Science on Tap Cincinnati, or on meetup.com. We have science education programs the first Wednesday of the month, unless there's a holiday. Our June 5th event will be on gender-affirming care. We will have a panel of physicians and medical students talking about what gender-affirming care is and what it is not, kind of demystifying it and creating a space in which people can ask questions about a topic that our culture tells us we're not supposed to talk about. So if you have questions, I encourage you to join us for that event. Be sure to follow our partners, Radio Artifact, on YouTube and Twitch. Give them a round of applause. All of our previous Science on Taps are out there on their YouTube channel if you want to go learn about science in Cincinnati. And without further ado, let's get to the beer samples.